Well, I didn't pay any attention to it at all until I started working with Philip Mantle.
Mm-hmm.
And then I heard from them, not from Charles was dead by then, but I read his book. And what happened was they were just normal people about their normal lives. They weren't UFO nuts or anything like that. They'd had their day of work, and they decided to go fishing, which they were down there in Pascagoula, where there's rivers and oceans and gulfs and everything. That's what people do, is go fishing. And so they did the normal thing after work and went fishing. And it was just their normal life. Calvin had a new car, and they were looking for a good fishing spot, and they didn't find it at first. But then Charles said, well, there's this good spot here. And it had a no trespassing sign up, and a lot of weeds and debris and everything to get to the pier, which Calvin wasn't very thrilled about because he had this new car, but and he was afraid. And so anyway, Charles was an older man. He was in his 40s, and he had military experience. He'd had life and death situations in a war. And so he was kind of so that he could take something. Calvin was a young teenager, and with his whole life ahead of him. And, you know, if he said UFO back then, everybody'd say, oh, what'd you do this morning? Did you see a UFO and all that and so on, and harassment. So he didn't want to have anything to do with it. But anyway, I mean, they were different stages in their life, and they were family friends. Calvin's father was a friend of the older man, and the older man's son was a friend of Calvin. And so they went to the pier and began fishing. And then they saw a blue light. And Calvin interpreted this as the police after him, and his car was there. And he was going to say, well, put Charles in jail because it was his idea. Don't do anything with me. But it turned out to be much, much, much worse than the police, because this thing came, and it wasn't like an airplane or anything. It was levitating, and no airplane sign or nothing that an airplane would do like that. And it opened some way, and all this light came out, and these three things came out, and two of them grabbed Charles and one grabbed Calvin, and they took him in to this thing. And in general, both of them kind of remembered being scanned. Charles said they couldn't really see anything because it was just real bright light, like they were in a light bulb or something. But Charles said this thing came out of the wall, and I mean, he couldn't really see it until it was close to him because it was so bright. But then it was like it scanned him. And Calvin said the same thing, like they were scanned. And then they were, of course, terrified, and they were wondering if this was done by the government, but they were also wondering if this was done by, UFOs. And so they were wondering, why, will they return me? Will they kill me? Will they put me in a zoo, or what's going to happen to me? And then they were released, and they were both having nervous trouble then. I mean, after they released, Calvin was standing on the end of the pier with his arms out, just in a posture like that, which is something that can happen. A strange posture can happen if you're really having a nervous breakdown or something like that. And Charles at first couldn't stand up, and then he could stand up, got so he could, and he had to kind of wake up Calvin, who was kind of in a trance. And so then this was just totally traumatic. And if that happened to you, nobody'd believe you, and especially back then. And so Calvin didn't want to say anything about it. And they discussed it, and they said, we're not going to talk about it. But then Charles had military experience. He had been in life and death situations. And he thought this might be that important, that it might be an invasion, it might be anything, and that he should report it. So he then did, which Calvin disagreed with him for 50 years.
Yeah, there was a lot of I heard the video or the audio of their conversation, and it's very disturbing to hear Calvin talking because you can tell the fear in his voice. Um, Now, you said that there was two witnesses to the abduction. Let me ask you that: were there any other people involved close by to the abduction?
Well, that's what's interesting about this particular incident is that with most abductions, there's no documentation at all. Well, in this one, we're still finding more witnesses. There was a lot of witnesses, and one of them, the first two people I interviewed were the Blair family, and we found them because Calvin, after he started talking about it, was on YouTube and had a video talking about the abduction. And this woman wrote in and said, yeah, my parents saw it. And so Philip contacted them, and I began interviewing them. And I began interviewing Maria Blair. And she said that, the first, his daughter, one of the comments she made was, but my parents were abducted, they just saw it. But what happened was they were on the other side of the Pascagoula River and saw this activity. And then later they found out about the abduction report. And they said, they thought, well, this is what we saw, but they didn't say anything and just told their own family. But 50 years later, their daughter made a comment on YouTube. And so anyway, there was Jerry and Maria Blair, and I contacted Maria Blair, and she said that they were sitting in their car, and he was going out in a ship to the oil rigs, but he was waiting for his supervisor to come who was late. And so they were sitting there in the car, and he went to sleep, and she was just watching. She said this thing was flying around that she thought was an airplane, but it didn't behave like an airplane because it was just flying around. She kept saying, well, it was searching for something, or the pilot is lost, he doesn't know where he's going. It was just flying around and around and around and around. Then she said that her husband decided to take his clothes to the car, and so they'd have to go down to the ship. And they'd have to walk down the pier and get in the ship and everything. She said it was about 9 o'clock, and he was walking down the pier in front of her. And as she was walking along, this thing that looked like a person just flopped up right in front of her on the pier. And then it went back down, and it never came back up to breathe for air. And she was just terrified. And she was very, very, very emotional about that. And then they went on down to the ship, and she didn't come back until about 12. She was terrified, and she ran up the pier to her car. Well, there were two things that, rang bells in my head, and one of them was that this thing that flopped up on the pier, and I asked her if it was a fish or a dolphin, and she said, no, it looked like a person. And she was very emotional about it. And then the other thing was that I wondered what happened, why they had 3 hours on the ship, and she didn't seem to be saying anything about what they were doing. And so anyway, I just kept in contact with her, whether she was the first person I interviewed, and I didn't know too much about it. I just said, just interviewing witnesses. But there were these two things that I paid attention to. And so a number of years later, about 2 years later, her husband became very sick. And then he was put on a ventilator and unfortunately died. But just before he went on the ventilator, he told her that they had been abducted, but that he had never told her, and that he was in some kind of contact with these, whatever they were, and that he felt protective of her, and he had told them not to bother her, to harm her. And so this was, I mean, not only was she wondering what on earth happened with all this, but then she finds out her husband seems to have been in contact with the UFO beings, and that would be pretty traumatic. And then Philip had her hypnotized after a while because her husband just died and nobody wanted to intrude on her for a while. But she kind of wanted to be hypnotized. And she remembered a little bit more about the abduction under hypnosis. But so that this was very unusual because usually with an abduction, there's one person and that's it. Well, here, there were two other witnesses that not only saw something, but may have been abducted themselves. So that was just totally unusual.
Now, you said there were several, and your book, which I'll bring up here in a moment. You have a couple of really great books on the Pascagoula story. You said there were a number of witnesses that have come forward over time. Can you give us an estimate of about how many so far?
Quite a few, like I'm estimating like about 100. When it happened that same night, the police not only heard from Charles, but from the police person that was taking notes at his phone, said that he had heard from about 50 people, and then more on the bridge that reported UFOs. And it was really hard to report anything like that because you had to, if you just said UFO, everybody'd laugh at you. And there was no place to report it. And like Charles had to try 3 times before he got his report out. But in spite of that, there were about 50 people that saw something odd that night. And this was before they would have been influenced by anything. They saw something. And then we began, when we started investigating, things were more open and people would talk about it. And so I interviewed about 50 more people. So
what are some of the things that you find to be very interesting in the sense that they overlap and they agree with other cases that have nothing to do with this?
Well, one thing, I just compare them to a number of other cases of abductions. And I actually had a chapter on abduction observables, which they have UFO observables. And so I thought I'd say abduction observables. Things that are in common about abductions. One of them is that oftentimes abductions will start with a light, and oftentimes it's a strange light. And like the one you were talking about in New York, this light transported her up to the object. And Calvin's in there. This one, Pascagoula, started out with, they didn't exactly know exactly what happened. They think it had a door that opened some way, and all this light came out. And that was one of the things that I said is in common. And a lot of times the light has strange properties, and sometimes not only are things abducted, but whole trucks and things like that are abducted, and especially if there's a green beam of light coming down. Sometimes the truck will, the witnesses will report their truck was abducted and they were in it, and things like that, which, but another thing that is in common is that the objects just appear. I mean, like with an airplane, they take off from an airport and fly in a certain path and then they land. With UFOs, they just appear and disappear, and that's it. They don't have a flight path. Another thing is, which happened here, I mean, it just kind of appeared. They didn't know where it came from or anything else, except that a lot of people saw something. So, but they didn't know where it came from or anything like that. Another thing is, sometimes in abductions, well, normally, there's things that look like beings. And in this case, what they reported is they thought they were robots, that they behaved in a mechanical way. And nobody believed them then. I mean, back then, everybody thought, oh, there's, beings in these things. But I've looked over a lot of other abduction reports, and a lot of abduction reports say that these beings look exactly alike and things like that, which makes me think, there's robots or something. Also, when they're inside, in this case, there was nothing except all this bright light. And that could be due to robots. I mean, robots don't need furniture and food and all that. They can just close up and start up again. Another thing is, another thing I was mentioning was time. And another thing that in some abductions, it's like tape recording. And I've talked to people that say they were living their normal lives, and then everything around them stopped, and they were pulled up and abducted, and then returned, and it's like they stopped the movie of your life going through and pulled you out and stuck you back in and turned everybody back on and things like that. Wow. And physical laws. In this case, this thing they saw levitated. There was no airplane sound, no wings, nothing like the Tic Tac object. It just, it was just there. And it wasn't on the ground. And these beings, or whatever they were, also levitated. They didn't walk on the ground. And when another thing that happens is, a lot of times when it happens, the people are paralyzed or like they're in a trance. And that's what happened to these, to them. They thought they might have been given shots, but which would be very unusual, because a lot of people just report, well, suddenly they can't move and they're paralyzed, which, that would be absolutely terrifying, to have somebody grab you and, take you aboard, and when you can't move, like your worst nightmare. And so I just went through a lot of things that were in common about abductions.